more than 3 decades since the end of the Vietnam War. The guns are long silent, but the conflict continues to inflict horrifying damage on millions of Vietnamese. They are the innocent victims of toxic chemicals used by US forces to clear the jungles. Agent Orange has now poisoned 3 generations, but the US says there's no scientific evidence to prove this. I'm Laura Kyle. On this edition of 101 East, we'll ask whether there'll ever be any justice for Vietnam's victims of Agent Orange. Between 1961 and 71, 80 million litres of toxic chemicals were poured over Vietnam. The US Army used the defoliant to deny the enemy cover and to destroy their food crops. But the effects of one of the most poisonous chemicals known to man reached far beyond the combatants. Millions of Vietnamese continue to suffer health problems, and babies are still being born with mental and physical defects. Hal Davis reports on the Vietnam War's most bitter legacy.
The ghostly traces of a long-gone war, written on the bodies and minds of Vietnam's children.
I feel so sad when I see her. I feel helpless. There's nothing I can do. The pain is so great because she hasn't done anything wrong. She's the victim of all this.
This is Hung, one of Vietnam's Agent Orange victims. She's now 34 years old, born blind and with severe brain damage. She lives in this one room in her family's Hanoi home, never leaving the house. Her father looks after her as best he can, feeding her, washing her, carrying her to the toilet, caring for her. He spent a decade fighting the South Vietnamese and the Americans in what's known in the West as the Vietnam War. He vividly remembers American planes dousing his position with toxic herbicides.
They sprayed us with a liquid. At the time, we were hiding in a tunnel underground. But even so, after they sprayed us, breathing was difficult, and our eyes watered as if we had pepper in them. We told each other they are spraying chemicals.
Tens of millions of litres of herbicide were sprayed by American forces on South Vietnam from 1961 to 1971. They were an attempt to make it easier to find North Vietnamese soldiers in the country's thick jungle. The best known was Agent Orange, taking its name from coloured markings on the barrels used to store the herbicides. The defoliants were contaminated with dioxin, a highly toxic chemical that's been linked with, among other illnesses, cancer. For many Vietnamese, it's clear that dioxin, and so the Americans, are responsible for the country's high level of birth defects.
All Vietnamese, not just Agent Orange victims, want the US government and the American chemical companies to take responsibility for the damage they have caused, not just to people's health, but also to the environment and the people of Vietnam.
Here in a small house in Hue province, that damage is obvious. This 21-year-old's father was also a soldier who remembers being sprayed. But further research is needed into how dioxin's effects pass down the generations. What does seem clear is that areas that were heavily sprayed have large numbers of children born with defects. A Japanese study found that children in such areas are 3 times more likely to have mental disabilities than those in places where no spraying took place. In the countryside, such problems are even more acute, made worse by poverty and a lack of access to health care. This family has 3 children. All have severe problems. The eldest daughter has extreme physical handicaps. Her sister is deaf and dumb, while their younger brother, also deaf and dumb, has profound mental disability. The family says that with limited help from the authorities, the children's condition has reduced them to poverty.
They just stay at home. They can't get jobs. Me and my husband have to stay in the house to look after them too, so we can't work. We really don't know what our future will bring.
My life is so miserable. I really cannot imagine how my future will be like. Even my mum is sick. She has pains in her arms and legs. And I have pains all over my body. So I really do not know what to do now.
Vietnam does spend some money on helping the victims of Agent Orange. Centres like this one near Hanoi, called the Friendship Village, help a tiny proportion of the affected, educating the young and treating veterans. While the families of some victims get direct financial aid, $50 million is spent annually this way. But it's a fraction of the amount needed when between 2 and 4.5 million people are thought to be affected. The obvious solution, many Vietnamese say, is for the US to contribute substantial amounts of aid. That's not something Washington seems ready to do. This is Khe Sanh, scene of one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. The US government spent billions in prosecuting that war, but for the victims of Agent Orange, so far, only $6 million has been pledged. The bodies of the Americans killed fighting on this hill, better known to them as Khe Sanh, were returned home. That happened across Vietnam during the war and after the conflict ended. The US has made a determined effort to bring the remains of missing servicemen home. It's cost well over $100 million, a laudable tribute to the country's troops, but also an indication of the relative unimportance of Agent Orange victims to Washington. But that's not lost on many Vietnamese.
3 million at first, and then another 3 million, a total of 6 million. Even after the extra money, it is such a small amount compared with a big issue like this. Many people cannot believe how unrealistic this is.
The first US combat troops in Vietnam landed in Da Nang in 1965. The massive airbase they were sent to protect is appropriately where much of the $6 million will be spent. It's now an Agent Orange hotspot. Defoliants were stored here with few precautions and sometimes simply dumped onto the ground. US government funds are helping pay for some of the cleanup. An American non-profit group, the Ford Foundation, is also helping, putting in concrete caps to help prevent dioxin leaking further into the soil. Its country director says that Washington's pledge of $6 million is at least a start.
To an outsider it seems slow, but the good news is that it's there, and it wasn't there before. That is, that there are beginning to be some resources, and now the challenge is to see that not only are they used briskly, but they're used well.
But for children like these in a Da Nang school, substantial help anytime soon is unlikely. In March, the US Supreme Court said it would not hear an appeal against the manufacturers. That effectively ends hopes of winning compensation. They're already members of the third generation of Vietnamese victims. The danger is that if Vietnam doesn't receive significant help soon to pay for testing and treatment, then this generation will not be the last one affected, condemning many more children to lives that are stunted and damaged.
Coming up after the break, we'll be speaking to the US ambassador to Vietnam to ask whether America is doing enough to help those affected by Agent Orange. Do stay with us on 101 East. Welcome back to 101 East. For more now on the impact of Agent Orange in Vietnam, we're joined here by Tao Griffiths, a country director for the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation. Thank you very much, Tao, for joining us. Now, the US has recently increased the amount that it's donated to Vietnam's victims of Agent Orange and to the cleanup of Agent Orange to $6 million US. Is it enough?
No, it isn't. it is still a very small amount of money compared to the amount of work that needs to be done in Vietnam to help the people who have been affected by Agent Orange and who are currently being affected by Agent Orange and dioxin. So it's not enough. However, we also need to acknowledge that it is it has a political significance, that amount of money, because it is unprecedented that for the first time ever, the Congress and the U.S. government put aside one budget line saying that this amount of money is to help Vietnam in specific.
How much more needs to be done? What does Vietnam need from the U.S.?
First of all, clean up what you left behind. There's a very well-known international environmental company from Canada called Hatfield. They developed what is called a hotspot theory, meaning that they identify areas that left behind by the U.S., particularly around the former U.S. air base, throughout the central and south of Vietnam. They have identified 28 hotspots, areas highly contaminated, out of which 7 are identified as key areas that need to be addressed.
As you know, the US disputes the link between these disabilities and Agent Orange. You've been working with these children who've got disabilities in, for example, the Da Nang area. How convinced are you by the link?
Well, the emphasis on the direct link between exposure to dioxin or Agent Orange or chemicals to health impacts of dioxin is the main sticking point of the ongoing discussion between the two countries. And that is also why the discussion between the two countries on this issue couldn't move forward. And until recently, a different approach is being adopted, meaning that we won't provide, assistance should be provided to people with disability, period.
Some people would question the Vietnamese government's own commitment to addressing the Agent Orange issue. A couple of facts for you. It allocates around $50 million a year to medical treatment for victims of Agent Orange, and yet spends $200 million on building a new Foreign Affairs Ministry building.
I'm not aware of those figures. However, every year the government of Vietnam spends $115 million in monthly allowances to disabled citizens. And given that amount of money within a context of a small budget of the government of a developing country like Vietnam, I think that's a fair amount of money, although more needs to be done on the Vietnamese government as well.
The joint scientific study that was set up between the US and Vietnam was cancelled unilaterally by the US in 2005. They said that Vietnam blocked internationally accepted scientific research. Why was that?
I don't think that would be fair to put that blame of pinpoint finger to any particular entity like that. In my work working with both Vietnamese and American on this issue of Agent Orange, we're very well aware of the fact that there have been many researches done by Vietnamese, Canadian, American and German scientists on the issues, and these studies has been published widely. So there's ample evidence where Vietnamese cooperate very well with international partners.
A 2003 report by the US Embassy here was very scathing of Vietnam. It said that it was launching a propaganda campaign, grossly exaggerating the number of Agent Orange victims to cover up its own healthcare deficiencies. It pointed to birth defects and said this was caused by iodine deficiencies, by birth injuries. What do you think your response is to that?
When was it released, and was it released publicly?
2003, it was classified as a sensitive document.
That's too bad. That's a pity. That's all I can say. When both sides are trying to make an effort to move closer to each other, I don't think comments like that would help to advance the agenda at all.
How many more generations of Vietnamese do you think are going to be affected by Agent Orange?
Well, currently it has been the 3rd generation, and as you know, dioxin is the most is a chemical that is most toxic known to human being. It is not degradable. It persists, and the impact of it can become greater with the passage of time. So this is one thing where I don't agree that people saying that, oh, this is the war legacy issue. It is the problem of the past, and the war ended 40 years ago. Move on. I said, no, it isn't. It is the issue of today, and it is an issue of tomorrow if we keep ignoring it.
Tao Griffiths, thank you very much for joining us.
You're most welcome.
Next up, we'll be joined by the US's top diplomat here in Vietnam, Ambassador Michael McCulloch. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Since 2007, you've had 2 installments from the US government of $3 million. How has that been spent?
Well, we've already started 3 different projects down in Da Nang related to disabilities and improving lifestyles of people with disabilities. We've also worked on a pilot project on bioremediation. My understanding is that the early results look very promising.
$6 million is somewhat of a paltry figure. It is indeed ridiculed somewhat throughout Vietnam.
Well, that's the way it goes, I guess. I mean, we try to, we're just beginning this work in terms of bioremediation and in terms of the disabilities assistance in this phase. We've already put out about $46 million in terms of dealing with disabilities of all kinds. So this is the amount of money that we feel is appropriate for the level of effort that's being put into it by the government of Vietnam and by ourselves.
It is interesting that $46 million has been set aside for disabilities in Vietnam, and yet $6 million has been set aside for Agent Orange.
Well, we don't actually say it's for Agent Orange. I mean, what we're doing here is we're continuing our work on disability. So much of this money is a continuation of the same work that we've been doing with the $46 million. The bioremediation and the remediation, the environmental remediation, was decided on in 2007 when President Chiet and President Bush met, and they agreed that we would try to work together on some environmental remediation.
Just to continue with this figure of $6 million, if I may, I just want to put it against the figure that Vietnam's Foreign Relations Committee says it needs to give disability allowances every year to the victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam. It says it needs between 360 and 820 million US dollars. 6 million is a drop in the ocean.
Well, right now I think we need about, we've spent almost $1 trillion trying to take care of the economic effects of the recent downturn. A lot of estimates are out there. I'm not sure how many of them are real, and I'm not sure about what the backup data is to warrant a figure like that. So I think people will come up with different estimates for different kinds of things.
Okay, well, let me give you another comparison. 6 million to Vietnam, 1.52 billion in annual payments to US veterans of Vietnam War who were exposed to Agent Orange.
Yeah, and so
how do the two figures compare?
Why would we be comparing those two figures?
Because the Vietnamese are victims of Agent Orange and the US war veterans are victims of Agent Orange.
In the United States, what we do for veterans is we try to take care of our soldiers. Now, whether, whatever disabilities that they face, we try to address those things. We do not, we have what we call a presumption that there may be some health effects from dioxin. We have not proved that, and there is no direct linkage yet. So we have decided that we will simply go with this presumption and help to treat our veterans. Now, I'm not an expert on these kinds of things, but that's the reason that we do it. And if the government of Vietnam would like to do it for their veterans, then that's a decision for the government of Vietnam.
So the US does not consider its responsibility towards the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange?
Well, the US government says that we want to look at the science. We want to see whether or not there is sound science here. To date, there has been no direct causality, I think, except maybe for one particular type of disease. And so as a result, no, we took care of all of our the war responsibilities when we signed our treaties back at the end of the war.
You say there's no direct causality, but let me present some findings to you. In August of this year, the Institute of Medicine based in the US said that there was evidence of association between Agent Orange exposure and the most deadly form of heart disease. In 1997, the WHO said that dioxin was one of the most dangerous chemicals to man, that 1 to 4 parts per trillion in breast milk was enough to form severe deformities in fetuses, and that there is actually 1,450 parts per trillion found in breast milk in mothers in Vietnam.
Well, I know that the one study that you referred to talked about association. If you read that study, it says that they make no statement about causality. So that's definitely true. Dioxin is a persistent organic pollutant, a POP, and that is one of the reasons that we've agreed to work with the government of Vietnam on trying to remove and clean up those areas. And I think right now, as I said, I think we've got some very promising results from the work we're doing in Da Nang, which is where the government of Vietnam has asked us to work. I think it's going to be good.
So all the studies that are out there at the moment are not acceptable to the US government?
There are many different studies, and I think the IME report that you referred to, every year or every 2 years, actually reviews all of that data. And their conclusion is that they cannot conclude that there is any direct causality. A number of the studies that have been done say that there may be some association, but if you look at the diseases that they're talking about, those diseases could be caused not only by dioxin, if in fact there is any kind of causality there, but they could also be caused by a number of other environmental pollutants.
How much proof do you actually need?
Well, you know, you have to go back and talk to all the lawyers and talk to everybody back in the United States. I just deal with the results that I'm told about.
In 2005, the US Justice Department said that opening courts to cases brought by former enemies would be a dangerous threat to presidential powers to wage war. Are you concerned that by giving compensation to victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam, you're setting a precedent for future wars?
Well, that's a legal question, and that's going to be decided by people back in Washington.
It's actually a governmental question.
Yeah, could be, and it's going to be decided by people back in Washington, not by me.
Is it not true that in 1963, when Operation Ranch Hand was underway, the US government knew about the effects of dioxin in Agent Orange?
I'm not aware of that at all.
Well, in 1963, the US government commissioned a study which showed that very low levels of dioxin caused significant deformations in lab animals.
Well, again, that is past history, and all I'm saying is that we're trying to deal with the situation today and looking forward. And again, I think that we're working very well with the government of Vietnam on addressing these issues.
You think you're doing enough?
I think we're working very well with the government of Vietnam on addressing these issues.
Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
Sure thing.
And that's all we have time for on this edition of 101 East. See you next time.